A candle flickers against the stone walls of a royal bedchamber. Gold gleams on every surface, but the air feels heavy, suffocating. The pharaoh leans close to a young woman draped in linen. She tries to smile, but her eyes betray unease. This is not a night of love, it's a ritual, a sacred act meant to please the gods, bind the bloodline, and keep power from slipping away. But behind the incense and chants lies a darker truth, one where intimacy is currency, women are offerings, and even death cannot sever the link between pleasure and power. In ancient Egypt, sex was never just about desire. It was about dominance, politics, and fear. When most people think of ancient Egypt, they picture pyramids, pharaohs, and glittering treasures buried in desert tombs. But behind the grandeur, there was another Egypt, one hidden in shadowed chambers, guarded temples, and forbidden scrolls. This was a world where royal bloodlines were preserved through incest, where the gods demanded physical acts as offerings, and where some rituals blurred the line between worship and cruelty. The same civilization that gave the world mathematics, medicine, and architecture also practiced intimate traditions that would shock modern society. Tonight we step beyond the veil into the bedchambers, temples, and tombs to uncover the most horrifying sexual practices of ancient Egypt. The temple air was thick with incense, curling in golden threads toward a ceiling painted with stars. Oil lamps cast flickering shadows over carved reliefs, gods and goddesses locked in eternal embrace, their bodies merging in a language older than words. In ancient Egypt, sex was not simply human instinct. It was divine will, the breath that kept the universe from unraveling. Every act of intimacy was a ripple through the cosmic order, a way to feed the gods their due. The cult of Hathor, goddess of love and fertility, claimed that human desire was sacred energy, a force that sustained not only life but the gods themselves. At the festival of drunkenness, the streets erupted into chaos. Wine flowed like the Nile in flood season, and masked dancers writhed in the torchlight, their movements part prayer, part provocation. Women adorned with lotus crowns sang hymns that doubled as seductive invitations, while men painted in ochre and gold performed for both mortal eyes and divine ones. To the pious, these were offerings, living sacrifices of the flesh, given freely to keep the favor of the heavens. But not all offerings were given freely. Some were chosen, plucked from their homes, and brought into the temple as if into the arms of the gods themselves. Priestesses, veiled in linen as sheer as mist, would guide initiates into shadowed chambers. Their bodies became vessels, tools through which the gods could touch the world. Pleasure was not the goal, obedience was. The gods demanded it, the priests enforced it, and no one dared question the ritual's holiness. In these moments the lines blurred. Was the embrace a prayer, or was it possession? Was the temple a sanctuary, or a prison gilded with sacred light? The same rites that bound the people to their gods would, in time, bind the royal family in ways far darker. For in Egypt, divinity demanded not only devotion, but surrender. In the marble cool silence of the royal palace, intimacy was never a private affair, it was a matter of state. Behind the high walls, where the scent of lotus and myrrh masked the stench of the city, unions were forged not from love, but from lineage. The pharaoh was not simply a king, he was a living god, his blood sacred, his body the vessel of divine authority. And what is divine must remain pure. To dilute that bloodline was to invite chaos, to risk the gods' withdrawal from the throne. Thus marriage was kept within the family, brother to sister, father to daughter, mother to son. It was not scandalous, it was policy. The priests justified it with myths, Osiris and Isis, divine siblings who ruled together in perfect harmony, their love a cosmic ideal. But the reality within the palace was far from harmonious. Royal women adorned with gold and lapis became both queens and sisters, both wives and daughters. The titles changed, but the cage remained. Some bore it with grace, mastering the art of the distant smile, their eyes hiding the dread of the marriage bed. Others resisted quietly, knowing open defiance meant political death or worse. For a royal woman, the body was not her own. It was a resource to be managed, traded and secured like grain or gold. Even the young princes were not spared. Groomed from birth for their role, they were taught that love was irrelevant, desire secondary. What mattered was the production of heirs, heirs who were not only legitimate in the eyes of the court, but untainted by common blood. But purity came at a cost. Generations of intermarriage left their marks, bowed spines, elongated skulls, and brittle bones. In the tomb of Tutankhamun, the boy king's mummified remains told a silent story, a clubbed foot, cleft palate, and the fragility of a life shaped by the narrowing spiral of the royal gene pool. The grandeur of his golden burial mask could not hide the fragility of the flesh beneath. In the dim corridors of the palace, whispers spread about the toll this policy took. Servants noticed the limp of a prince, the sickly pallor of a princess. But to speak of it aloud was treason. Illness was not weakness, it was divine mystery. Deformities were explained away as marks of favor from the gods, a strange kind of blessing that justified the cycle continuing. And so the unions went on, each wedding a reaffirmation of royal power. The court scribes recorded them in formal, beautiful hieroglyphs. Brother weds sister, daughter becomes wife. To the public, these inscriptions were proof of the pharaoh's sacred role, but behind the carved walls, the truth was written in the eyes of the women forced to stand beside their kin in ceremonial robes. There were moments when the mask slipped, a queen's sharp intake of breath when her new husband, her brother, took her hand, a young girl's tearful glance at her mother as she was led to the bridal chamber. These moments never left the walls of the palace, buried under the weight of tradition. The political necessity of keeping power within the bloodline was absolute, and sentiment had no place in it. Over time, even the boundaries of family blurred. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces. The web grew tighter, the bloodline more tangled. The gods were invoked to bless every union, as if divine approval could cleanse the unease that lingered behind closed doors. For in this world, love was irrelevant, and choice was a luxury reserved for no one, not even the most powerful woman in the land. Intimacy was law, sealed in the name of the gods, enforced by the crown and recorded in stone for eternity. And yet somewhere deep within the palace, another truth was beginning to stir, that power built on such fragile foundations could crumble, and when it did, the same blood that was so fiercely guarded might one day spill freely into the sand. The temple at dawn was a living breath, the slow exhale of incense curling through shafts of morning light, the shuffle of sandaled feet over limestone floors worn smooth by centuries of devotion. Here the gods were not silent stone, they were present, listening, watching, every column painted with scenes of harvest and birth, every wall carved with stories of the divine seed spilling into mortal soil. This was not a place for the squeamish. Fertility was not a metaphor. It was a performance, and the audience was the gods themselves. The high priestess stood at the heart of it, her skin oiled and glistening in the torchlight, her linen gown translucent under the weight of gold collars and turquoise beads. She was no ordinary servant of the divine. In the eyes of the faithful, she was Hathor made flesh, the goddess of love, pleasure, and procreation walking among mortals. To touch her was to touch the favor of the gods. And so in ceremonies that outsiders would call obscene, her body became an altar. The rites were ancient, older than the kingdom itself. On certain nights when the moon hung low and red over the desert, she would lie upon a bed of reeds while the high priest, representing the god Osiris, approached her with solemn, deliberate steps. Their union was not seen as human desire, but as a reenactment of the divine coupling that birthed the world. The onlookers, priests, nobles, sometimes even the pharaoh, did not avert their eyes. They watched because watching was part of the ritual. Witnessing the act was believed to feed its power, ensuring that the Nile would flood, the crops would grow, and the wombs of the land, both human and earth, would remain fertile. To the people outside these sacred walls, such rites were a mystery whispered about in the marketplace, but for those within, it was the heartbeat of their belief. There was no shame, only reverence. The act was holy because it was necessary, a binding contract between gods and mortals, sealed in the flesh. But holiness has a way of attracting corruption. Over time, the lines between sacred duty and personal indulgence began to blur. Some priests used the rites as an excuse to take what they desired under the shield of religion. Young acolytes were initiated not through prayer, but through submission. The temple became both sanctuary and snare. The high priestess knew the danger. She saw how the faces in the crowd sometimes shifted from reverence to hunger, how the hands that placed offerings at the altar trembled not from awe but from lust. Still, she performed her role, for to refuse was to betray the gods. The weight of the kingdom's fertility, of its very survival, pressed against her with each ritual embrace. There were whispers, too, that some pharaohs demanded these rites for themselves, claiming the role of the god not only in politics but in the bed of the goddess's earthly vessel. The line between statecraft and sacred flesh grew faint, until it was gone entirely. And yet, even in the midst of this, the people continued to believe. Year after year, the Nile rose, the harvest came, and children were born beneath the unblinking eyes of the gods. Proof enough, they said, that the rites worked. Proof enough that the divine still walked among them, and that pleasure in its purest form was a gift from the heavens. But in the quiet after the ceremonies, when the incense burned low and the temple was emptied of its watchers, the high priestess would lie awake, staring at the painted ceiling. She wondered whether it was truly the gods who demanded these acts, or the men who spoke for them. For if the rituals were ever revealed as human invention, if the divine veneer was stripped away to show only mortal desire, then the foundation of the kingdom's faith would crumble like sun-baked clay. And in that ruin all the sacred unions, all the guarded bloodlines, all the whispered justifications would mean nothing. It began as such downfalls often do, with a whisper. At first it slithered through the narrow streets and shadowed corners of the market, a rumor that the gods had turned their faces away. The Nile's waters had been sluggish that year, rising too late and too low to flood the fields as they should. Crops withered, bellies shrank, and hunger stripped the people's patience bare. Misfortune was always looking for someone to blame, and in a land ruled by divine law, it was the keepers of that law who found themselves first in the crosshairs. Eyes that once watched the temple's rites in reverent silence now narrowed in suspicion. The high priestess, once the living embodiment of Hathor, was suddenly just a woman, flesh and blood, flawed, fallible. Some said her beauty had faded, that the gods had withdrawn their favor. Others whispered of defilement, that she had shared the sacred bed not in devotion but in greed, taking lovers for personal pleasure rather than divine will. Whether truth or venom, the accusations spread like wildfire, fanned by famine and desperation. The pharaoh's court took notice. In times of abundance, the throne had indulged the temple's eccentricities, even participated in them. But now every grain of wheat was worth more than gold, and the murmurs of the streets threatened to swell into revolt. The pharaoh could not afford to appear weak. If the temple had failed to keep the gods appeased, then someone would have to pay, and that someone would be the high priestess. The summons came at dusk. She was led from her chambers by guards who did not meet her eyes, their sandals slapping against the stone in an unbroken rhythm of judgment. The great hall of the pharaoh loomed ahead, its pillars like the ribs of some ancient beast, holding aloft the weight of centuries. At the far end, the ruler sat upon the throne, shrouded in gold and shadow, the crook and flail crossed over his chest. The trial was no trial at all. Witnesses, carefully chosen, conveniently motivated, stepped forward to tell of rituals performed without proper rites, of offerings kept for personal gain, of nights when the high priestess took the god's role into her own hands. The truth was irrelevant. What mattered was the spectacle. The court had to see her fall, so that the people might believe the pharaoh's hand was firm and just. Her sentence was announced in the same breath as her condemnation. She would be stripped of her sacred titles, her body no longer the vessel of the goddess, but a warning to all who might corrupt divine law. The punishment was not simple execution, that would have been merciful. No, hers would be public, ceremonial, and unforgettable. On the appointed day, the temple gates were thrown open, and the people flooded in, their voices a low, restless tide. The high priestess was led to the altar where, for years, she had lain as the god's chosen. Now her arms were bound, her body exposed not as an object of worship, but as one of shame. Incense burned thick in the air, not to sanctify the rite, but to mask the stench of fear and sweat. The priests who had once stood beside her now recited the rites of cleansing, their voices steady, their eyes cold. They anointed her not with sacred oils, but with the bitter sap of the sycamore, said to draw the goddess's spirit out of flesh. As the chants grew louder, she felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her, their hunger no longer for blessing but for vengeance. And then came the act that would seal her fate in memory. Her sacred jewelry was torn away, one piece at a time, each golden bead clattering against the stone like the tolling of a death bell. The linen gown, that symbol of purity and divine service, was ripped from her shoulders. She stood, bare and unadorned, no goddess now, only a woman awaiting the judgment of mortals. When it was over, she was cast out into the crowd, the gates of the temple closing behind her like the jaws of a beast. The people parted to let her pass, some spitting, others merely staring. She walked into the desert night alone, her shadow stretching long against the sand, until it vanished into darkness. From that day on, the rites continued, altered, cleaned of the excesses she had been accused of, but something had broken. The faith was still there, but it was thinner now, hollowed out. The goddess still had her priests, the pharaoh still had his power, but the flesh that once bound gods and men had been declared fallible, and in that admission, the divine was just a little less divine. Years passed, and the famine eased. The Nile rose again, the fields turned green, and the people's bellies swelled with grain. The pharaoh remained, temples flourished, and new high priestesses took their vows. On the surface, it was as if nothing had happened. The old rites continued, the incense burned, and the chants echoed off the same stone walls. But in the shadows, in the markets, in the fields, in the hushed gossip of servants, the story of the fallen high priestess lingered like a scar that refused to fade. Mothers whispered her name as a warning to their daughters, that beauty fades, that favor is fickle, that the gods' love can be stolen away as quickly as it is given. Merchants told her tale as proof that no one, not even the vessel of the divine, could escape the reach of politics. The desert kept its secret, but sometimes travelers claimed to see her figure wandering the dunes at night, the moonlight clinging to her like a second skin. She was neither goddess nor mortal now, but something in between, a shade bound to the memory of her own undoing. And though her voice had been silenced in life, her story spoke louder in death, carried on the wind, passed from ear to ear until no one could remember which parts were truth and which were myth. In the end, that was her true immortality. Not the sacred role she had once played, not the power she had wielded, but the way her downfall had slipped into the bones of the people's faith. She had been a woman elevated to a goddess, then torn down to dust, and in that arc, the people had learned something dangerous, that the divine was not untouchable, that gods could bleed, and perhaps that was the lesson the pharaoh had feared most.